Now this is a mess of notes on this board right here, but December features an incredible amount of opportunity. And it features opportunity because the deer season is winding down, and almost every property in the country that's a whitetail country, from North Carolina to Oklahoma to Florida, Texas, and all the way up north, and all the northern Midwest states we talk about, from Vermont, Maine, all the way over to North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, wherever it might be, properties have been overhunted, overpressured, and there's a lack of quality food and quality cover. And that fall and winter cover is completely different than early season, where deer are scattered everywhere. Think of December and the late season as deer congregating not only to fall food, fall cover, and that cool season opportunity for them to actually where they can sustain energy and stay warm and live, but they're flocking to areas that have been unpressured by hunters. And when you think about it, that's probably well less than 5% of all whitetail parcels. Number one, define daylight bucks during the late season. I want you to be the one. And when I mean the one, I mean because if you have that property in the neighborhood where deer are actually congregating, you probably are the only property in the neighborhood, because most properties have been spoiled and spooked out by that time. I challenge you to be the one. You have to be different. If you've been hunting poorly, if you don't have food sources, if you're hunting in the same locations, not seeing deer, and you're just expecting them to show up, and you don't have that fall food and cover, you're not going to see deer. So you have to be the one that's doing it the right way, not the wrong way. I've seen some complaints online lately where I'm just not seeing the deer. It must be nice to see those bucks. Well, we work for those bucks. That's the difference with private land. Private land requires a lot of work. If you think you're just going to show up on private land in a good area and have a great hunt, you're sorely mistaken. There's a lot of stand management that takes place, a lot of hunting management. You have to hunt strategically, and if you don't, the further into the season you get, the fewer deer you can expect to see. But if you're doing it right, the further you progress into the season, the more deer you're going to see, and the more deer you're going to see during daylight. That also means you have to have fall food and fall cover. We'll talk about that in a second. That means if you're going to be the one, you're going to be the one that hasn't been using an ATV to access your stands. You might be able to get away with that a little bit in September and October, a little bit, but it's never the best thing to do. You can get away with it maybe. But, I saw a comment on YouTube this morning, and I answered pretty lengthy because I'm passionate about the subject. He said, well, I have to go up a mountain in the morning. Well, what's a mountain? Maybe he does travel 2 hours up a mountain to hunt whitetails, out in some mountain somewhere, Virginia, West Virginia, maybe someplace like that. But for the most part, for example, where we hunt, we literally are walking uphill almost every step, some to the part where our feet are sliding out from under us. But we're walking uphill sometimes for 40 minutes straight to get into a stand with several breaks fit in. Someone said that the ATVs spook less than sweat. Well, I'll tell you what, if you're using an ATV consistently, you won't have any deer to be spooked by your sweat. And you can manage your sweat, you can manage your scent. Your scent should be managed by thermals and the use of thermals, and what we talk about in this site. If you look up my playlist, Hunting Hills and Thermals. If you're sweaty and you're getting into these hills and these areas and you have hard treks into your property, your stand location is the best form of scent control. So when you're managing your scent by stand location, you're blowing your scent into an area where there shouldn't be deer. And people say, well, you can never expect to be where deer are going to be. Well, I tell you to actually hone your skills a little bit better as a whitetail hunter. Understand where you're putting your stands and know that you're putting them on the edge of whitetail movement, not in the whitetail movement. And that's how I hunt. That's how we shoot all the bucks. We've shot 9 bucks so far this year as a family. Call us greedy, but we have tags. We hunt in multiple states. That's 3 states worth of tags, and we hunt until we don't have tags anymore or the season ends, whichever comes first. Low impact hunting. ATV is not. I love ATVs. We use them all summer. We use them for work. Use them for deer retrieval. But if you're that one in the neighborhood that's hunting low impact, you're not using ATVs, you're not spooking deer when you go out in the woods, you're going to have a huge benefit when it comes to attracting deer in the late season, because very, very few of your neighbors are doing it. I would say 1 in 20 neighbors are the ones that really are collecting the deer, and you can bet where those mature bucks are going to be when it comes to that time. Number 2, winter food and cover. Really, you're focusing on fall, because that fall food that begins to really peak in October, November, December, it doesn't matter if it tails off in January, February. If you attract the deer and your land peaked in November, you win, your deer win. and you're going to be the one holding those deer. What I mean by fall or winter food, and especially that fall food, we're using just greens here to attract the deer. In fact, the deer they've started hitting the corn, but they're not hitting the corn on a heavy degree right now. That's going to be more like December, January, because we've had a warm spell here. But they're hitting the greens every single day during the daylight. On those food sources, we can't afford to spook those deer. So the blinds that we're using, if you spook one deer getting in and out of that blind, then you need to move the blind, not use the blind, put up another pop-up somewhere where you can watch these deer and observe them every single day. If you're spooking those deer, especially this time of year, deer are very reactive to pressure, so much different than September and October, even early November with the rut. But when you get into the late season, you spook one deer, two deer, you do it a couple nights in a row, and that food source is done. It doesn't matter if it's clear cut on public land or a really nice food plot on private land. Now, if you have food sources that you're hunting, you have to have adjacent fall cover. That means high stem count cover. That means briars, hardwood regeneration, woody shrub tips, whatever it might be that you can actually have browse and cover. They're not feeding out in the open hardwoods, and that's why when you see forestry practices that are going in for oak stand management. We have oaks out here. The worst thing I could ever do is try to make an oak savanna or kill all the, quote, undesirables like box elder and poplar in favor of those oak trees out there. I just make a deer desert because it doesn't matter what's going on in September on my land or how pretty the woods looks in June, July, August. I need that high stem count, regeneration, and cover, something that gives a deer browse all day long in their bedding areas. And if I just have an open woodlot of oaks and I have herbicided and hack and squirt out the quote undesirables out of there and it's a big open woods, I've failed as a whitetail manager. I've excelled as an oak tree manager. Which one do you want to be? You have to have fall food in cover. That means a high stem count cover and those quality food sources. Now you might be in a neighborhood where you're up north, no one has food plots. Well, then you can get away with managing and rotating clear-cut pockets on your property, and that will become the food source. But obviously you can't just clear-cut the whole property and let it go, because now 8 to 10 years down the road you're not going to have deer because you have a high stem count of pole timber and it's not offering any food. The deer go elsewhere. But when you're on private land, food plots are a must. You can't ever build a herd, attract a herd, grow a herd, pass on young bucks and bring them to the next season with just cover and browse alone. You have to have that high quality food source, because there's always someone in the neighborhood that has standing corn, standing beans, or high quality food plots, and they're going to draw deer from miles around into that late season food source. Really important point about this low quality or quality level of your food and cover. Low quality food sources or average quality food sources or adequate food sources trumps high quality pressured, hunter pressured food sources or cover any day, any time, any month of the season. But when it gets into December, it's even more critical. You can get away with standing rye fields, brassica fields. I see debates online, which better, brassica or cereal grains like rye, wheat, and oats. That's just ridiculous. The best food that you can get is the food that's actually standing in December and makes it till December. So up in the UP of Michigan where I was at, we had up to 260 acres at one time, low value, low quality timber and ground, a lot of wetland. And brassicas were awesome, but if they weren't standing in October, they did nothing for us. If we had layered rye, that's why I came up with the layered rye practices and developed that and perfected that 15, 20 years ago, because I wanted to improve the volume of cereal grains going into the wintertime so that a deer, when every bite it took, instead of 100 pounds of rye per acre and there's one stem every 2-3 inches, we're putting 300 pounds layered at 100, 100, 100, or 150, then 150. But you're looking at filling the space horizontally so that every munch a deer takes, they actually get a mouthful of green instead of a couple sprigs here and there. So if that's the best you can get standing, awesome. If you're down south, you don't have doe problems and doe factory concerns during the summertime where you have too many does and fawns during the summertime, then clover is a good option down in Kentucky, down in West Virginia, down in southern Illinois, over into Missouri, Oklahoma even. If you can have that clover standing into in good volume into December and it didn't create that doe factory problem during the summer, then clover is even a good option. So there's no one right food, and if people are arguing that one's right or the other, they don't have the experience to be in the argument because they obviously haven't seen all the different scenarios of food plot situations can take place. But bottom line is, doesn't matter if it's low quality. The worst thing you could do is ever say, okay, alfalfa has the most nutrients, then brassica, then soybeans, then rye, clover in there, wherever it might be, and choose, well, I'm picking the best. That's not how it works, guys. You have to manage your food plots to be attractive in November, December, and what you need to plant is determined by your soil, your size of food plots, the region, the number of deer. There's a lot of factors to consider, way more than what's the most nutritious. If you focus on that, you'll probably lose. So you have to be the one, the way you hunt, doing it right. And then number two, you have to have that quality food and cover. Number three, let's get to the hunt, because you have to have all this first. You have to be hunting well. You have to have low pressure property. You have to have that fall food and cover. Number three, you have to have defined morning and evening stand locations. Morning stand locations have to be on the outside of bedding, and you're accessing well away from food. A lot of times you're not seeing those deer for an hour or two, even on 40 acres, as they come back into those bedding areas after daylight. If you try to sit on an evening stand that's on a food source, you think, well, they're coming into this, I'm going to go sit in there in my redneck or my favorite blind, and you spook those deer out in the morning, you're not going to see them in the evening. In fact, it might be a mile or 2 miles away at that point in the afternoon, evening. You sat in the wrong stand for the time of day. Very critical. Do not sit in the wrong stand. Morning stands are bedding areas, between bedding areas, or stands you can get in and around of food. They're stands you can, a lot of times, you don't have to walk through that bedding. You're out walking to the outside with the wind in your favor. You're waiting for those deer to come back to their beds, or between those beds for the second rut in the early part of the late season, or just simply getting back to their beds in the late season. I often don't encourage using morning stands in the late season unless it's a second rut, like what is going on right now in early December in our area, in the southwest Wisconsin, southeast Minnesota area. Evening stands on food sources or on the way to food, areas where you're not bumping those deer out of those bedding areas. The two are not one and the same, and that's why a lot of times during an all-day sit, hunters are sitting in a stand all day that is slanted towards morning or evening food, morning bedding. They have a great half day, and they're wasting their time in the rest of the day. They're not maximizing their opportunity. That 10 out of 10 stand that's a morning stand turns into a 2 out of 10 or a 1 out of 10 in the evening. You don't want to mix those two up. A lot of those all-day sits just aren't working. They're wasting a lot of time for folks. Number 4, let the deer pour in. The cool thing about the late season is if you have deer attracted to your unpressured food sources and cover, they're going to keep coming in. And that's a beautiful thing, because if you hunt with defined stands, you're not hunting with ATVs, you're not hunting out of stands that'll blow deer out in the evening on a food source, then you could just let them come in. You might have the biggest buck from 2 to 3 miles away come into that food source. But how many people get to that point in the season? How many people actually get to the point where you can let them pour in because you have unpressured food and unpressured cover? You go take one sit in the wrong location on that food source, and you spook out those deer in the evening, you're done. A lot of times for the rest of the season, because you push those deer away, they find an unpressured food source a couple miles away and they stay. And you know what's interesting about all of this? We'll talk about does next. Or that's the bonus one down there after number 5. But we'll talk about does right now. Does they can take a lot of stress. They're a lot more forgiving than mature bucks. Mature bucks are solitary, independent thinkers. Does are herd mentality. Does focus on food. They don't want to leave. Does are more homebodies. They want to stick close to their afternoon food source. You can get away with pushing the does around a little bit, but in the late season, that limit can't be pushed very far. And if you're expecting mature bucks to come in and you're randomly spooking deer, they're just not going to come in. Let the deer pour in. It's a really cool thing. You should see more deer in December than you do in November, more deer in November than you see in October, and finally more deer in October than you see in September. It should be a build-up to that primary time of the year, because guess what? You talk to your friends, your neighbors, and most hunters, they're seeing a lot fewer deer in December than they are in September, and that's why you don't take deer census in August and September. That's the scientific time to do it, and that's a very, very poor time to take deer census. Your deer census should be based on October, November, because that not only reflects a true hunting herd, but it reflects how you do as a hunter, how you do as a land manager, how you're accessing your stands. If you're doing it all wrong and poorly, you're going to see fewer deer as the season progresses. If you're doing it the right way, you're going to see more. Let them pour in. It's a lot of fun. Number 5, when you do shoot a deer, Dante shot a beautiful buck. He shot a beautiful buck on Thanksgiving evening. Diane was sitting with him in the evening. We had a great Thanksgiving day at our new home. And no kitchen, so we found a really nice local restaurant. I think it's called the Black Horse, that sold Thanksgiving dinners. And so Ariana, Dante, and Diane and I were able to sit and have a great Thanksgiving. And then Dante went out with Diane in the evening, and he shot a beautiful buck. And so that was a lot of fun. And we waited till after dark. I got in from where I was hunting. I picked up the Kubota. They didn't even exit their blind because we wanted to spook them with the Kubota after dark. After dark is key. We were able to go in and get that deer, get him out of there, and whether you shoot him in the morning or the afternoon, I love getting deer after dark and retrieving them at that time, because if you're doing a great job, deer should focus on your property during the daylight and for that last feeding of the day. And then as you get into after dark, they're somewhere else. On your neighbor's land, there's so many people this time of year. We're only seeing deer in the middle of the night. Well, that's where I want those deer to go to. So when you're getting your deer after dark on a well-managed property, that typically means you're not spooking deer because they're just not there. They're leaving and going to their dark time hours, and they're in those locations and those places. And let's face it, it's cool out. So you have all day. You can wait because it's cold and the weather's cold to go get those deer in most locations. Now, down south, North Carolina, Georgia, wherever it might be, Louisiana, Florida, that might not be the case. You might have to go get that deer. You can't let that deer waste. But after dark, whether it's October, November, December, we have great luck with not spooking a lot of deer and not having that lasting effect, as opposed to going in there during the daylight, spooking out deer, and then those deer not coming back, especially the mature bucks, for 2 or 3 weeks or more. What's really cool about letting the deer pour in and letting your property fill up with deer, does are very dependable. Does are very reliable for hitting the same food sources at nearly the same minute of the day every single day. If you want to meet your harvest objectives and shoot some does, to me there's no better time than at the end of the season. Could be early season, could be the early season youth hunts before the season even begins for the rest of the hunters in your state. But you're shooting those does early, or you're waiting until the end of the season. A lot of times we're waiting to the 4-day doe hunt after muzzleloader in Wisconsin, where it's doe only for the entire state. We're going in there and we're shooting those does. We're shooting a pile of them. I shot 2 last year in one day, just because we wanted to shoot a couple more, and it was easy to do. It was that doe hunt, so we were sitting out there with 3 of us in the blind with rifles, waiting to shoot does, and we were able to shoot some does right on that last day to where we didn't spook the bucks. It's not all about bucks. That's not the only thing of the herd, but the lowest hole in the bucket is buck management. Are older bucks on your land. That's the lowest hole in the bucket. So if you strive to have a good doe herd, that's as easy as possible. I raised a lot of does in the UP of Michigan in a very low deer density area. Could fill a property with does just with good habitat, good food, and hunting it right. The trick is getting mature bucks on there and attracting the oldest bucks in the neighborhood. And if you're shooting does all season long, that's not going to happen. If you're shooting does on opening day, horrible, of gun season, horrible time to shoot a doe, unless you already have a buck on the ground and you have to go in and retrieve that buck anyways. Then by all means, if you need to shoot 5 does, shoot them, pile them up, get them out of there. And of course, there's a lot of properties out there. Our property in Minnesota, it was ravaged by poachers for years. It's just building up. We have more bucks on the property than does right now. We want to see the does increase in population a little bit going into next year. So we're not targeting does this year on this property. Next year, the year after, we might have to target 10. We'll just see how that works. But not every property should you shoot does just because you have doe tags. Really, hunting skill. You have to have all the ingredients of fall food, fall cover, but you have to hunt it properly. There could be neighbors around here, there could be neighbors in Wisconsin or people by you that complain about you having the deer and them not seeing any. If they're on private land, they just need to do it right. You have to have fall food, you have to have fall cover, you have to hunt with skill. You can't just go out on the property and spook deer. You have to hunt as if you're a predator. We forget these skills that we have. You know, it truly is. You know, it's kind of like people complain about not having deer, but they're hunting poorly. Maybe they're hunting with ATVs, driving to their stand. They don't have food sources. They're not working on the fall habitat. Well, guess what? When it comes to December, you're not going to have deer. But there is a way to reverse that, and I hope this all makes sense. You can find daylight bucks on your property next season, and maybe you can even turn it around by the end of this month. But it's possible. It takes some planning, and again, private land is hard work. If you don't want to work that hard down the hunt, I suggest hunting public land. I hunt public land every year. I like public land because it's just boot time. And it's a lot of couch time, table time, looking at funnels, looking at aerial photos. You can just kind of figure it out. But, spraying 8 acres of plots 3 times, planting 11, 12 acres of plots, or 5 acres, 3 acres, working on the timber, working on the habitat, creating grass plantings, mock scrapes, camera locations, and then strategizing about when to use what area of your stand and your property at what time so you're not spooking deer. What are morning stands, evening stands, working on defining those. A lot of hard work that has to be done the right way, and a lot of times if you're not doing it the right way, no matter what you do habitat-wise, you can't overcome. If you're not using hunting steel, you're not going to be able to let those deer pour in. Find daylight bucks this year. You might even be able to find a neighbor, a friend who has not hunted the land. You can find those where they're really starting to herd up. Maybe find a hidden clear cut on public land. The sign is so evident right now, especially in snow. You can create that daylight opportunity even into December. You just have to be the one that's different than everybody else, and you'll find a pile of deer that you never expected. You'll get to enjoy the second rut. You'll get to enjoy the late season feeding opportunities next year and beyond, every year, if you follow these tips for finding daylight bucks during the late season. Well, if you made it to the end of this video, you're obviously interested in whitetail habitat solutions, what I have to teach, and you will love my new web class series. The first one is how to design your whitetail property. It's out now. The link is in the description. I invite you to check it out. It's on my website. Can't wait to hear about it.